10 Bizarre Ancient Roman Taboo Traditions. Taboo Tradition number 1. The dinner entertainment, or how to gross out your guests. Forget Netflix, ancient Romans had a live-action horror show during dinner. They would bring in actors to stage death scenes, but not the fun, Shakespearean kind. More like, is that guy actually dying? Kind. Roman hosts would even sprinkle a little extra flavor to the meal by hiring gladiators to do a live reenactment of their latest battle. Who needs salt when you have the sweat of a wounded warrior? Some of the wealthier hosts had a special dish served, called gustum caeli, which literally means a taste of heaven. Spoiler, it was actually stuffed dormice. Yum. Instead of asking for a second helping of wine, you might want to check if the cupbearer was an ex-gladiator. He's got one eye on you, and the other on your jugular. If the entertainment was particularly gruesome, it was considered polite to offer a round of applause, with the hands you didn't cover your eyes with. In Rome, if your host didn't provide some kind of violent spectacle, you had every right to leave and complain to your neighbors about the lack of decapitations. And then there was the host who went the extra mile by having slaves dressed up as famous figures, just so they could be killed in front of you while you enjoyed your stuffed olives. But don't worry, if you were squeamish, there were always after-dinner vomitoriums for your convenience. Nothing says party like a little post-meal purging. It wasn't unusual for dinner guests to lose their appetite, especially when they were served a roasted animal, still in its skin, as a centerpiece. A little too realistic for most. And if you survived all that, you might get dessert. Cakes shaped like body parts. Imagine biting into a finger and realizing it's got a creamy center. Deliciously disturbing. Taboo tradition number 2. The public baths, a little too much sharing. Roman baths were the ultimate social network, where you could gossip, network, and accidentally brush up against someone's elbow. Or, more than an elbow. These bathhouses were co-ed because apparently, the Romans believed that awkward eye contact was the height of social interaction. Imagine chatting with your senator while you're both stark naked, discussing the latest gladiator match. Nothing says power move like being naked in public. The baths were a one-stop shop. Steam rooms, hot tubs, massages, and a place where you could contract every skin disease known to mankind. Talk about multitasking. If you thought the gym locker room was bad, wait until you saw the Romans scraping off their sweat with a strigil. Goodbye dirt, goodbye dignity. Bath attendants would oil you up like a Thanksgiving turkey, and you just have to go along with it. Try slipping out of that one. Don't even get me started on the communal sponges they used instead of toilet paper. Shared public hygiene at its absolute worst. You might want to pass on the bathroom trip. For those really wanting to make an impression, there were bathhouse parties where everyone was naked, but some were just a little too enthusiastic with the wine. You might run into your boss, your ex, or your neighbor all in one visit. The only thing worse than small talk at the bathhouse is big talk at the bathhouse. If you didn't like the heat, too bad. The hottest rooms were designed to make you sweat out every sin you ever committed, or were about to commit after bath time. Taboo tradition number 3. Saturnalia, when Romans invented the office holiday party. Saturnalia was like Christmas, New Year's Eve, and Mardi Gras had a wild, toga-wearing love child. Everything was upside down, including your chances of keeping your dignity. Slaves and masters would switch roles. If your slave didn't make you dance in public wearing a silly costume, he wasn't really into the spirit of things. Romans would wear brightly colored clothes, or just go full-on weird with their outfits, like dressing up as Saturn. That's right, the god himself. Just to confuse everyone. No one worked during Saturnalia, which was probably a good thing because most people were too drunk to even remember what their job was. Gift-giving was huge, but think less thoughtful present and more cheap gag gift. Romans were the original secret Santa trolls. Public gambling was totally legal, so naturally, everyone gambled like they just invented the concept of losing money. The streets were filled with loud, drunken singing, basically like any modern holiday party, but with more togas and less karaoke. People would yell Io Saturnalia, which was Latin for woohoo, Saturn. It was the ancient equivalent of shouting Happy New Year, but with more slurred speech. If you weren't already tipsy, you were doing it wrong. Wine was practically the official drink of Saturnalia, and there was plenty of it. Like, lakes of it. The whole festival lasted for a week, or until everyone passed out, whichever came first. Taboo tradition number 4. Gladiatorial games, blood sport as a family outing. Forget baseball. In ancient Rome, families would pack up the kids for a fun day of watching people get sliced and diced. The original bloodthirsty crowd, with popcorn optional. Gladiators weren't just warriors, they were ancient celebrities. Think of them as the WWE stars of the Roman world, but with more actual stabbing. Some emperors got a little too into it, like Commodus, who thought he was Hercules and decided to fight in the arena himself. Spoiler, it didn't end well for his opponents. The games were a great place to pick up dating tips, like how to impress your crush by cheering the loudest when someone gets a spear to the gut. If the crowd didn't like the match, they could literally decide who lived or died. Ancient Yelp reviews had nothing on Roman bloodlust. Wild animals were often part of the show. Nothing says family fun like watching a lion chase a guy around the arena. Who needs theme parks? The really wild shows had hundreds of gladiators fighting at once, like a bloody free-for-all. Basically, the Hunger Games, but without the teens. Gladiatorial schools trained fighters to be lean, mean killing machines. But let's not forget, they were also slaves. So, it was kind of a lose-lose situation. Women fought as gladiators, too. They were rare, but when they showed up, they stole the show. Girl power, Roman style, between the gore, the glory, and the occasional dismemberment. The games were the ultimate ancient reality show. You just couldn't look away, even if you wanted to. Taboo tradition number 5. The emperor's divine status. No pressure, but you're a god now. If you thought modern politicians had egos, try telling an emperor he's literally a god. Not just in the metaphorical, I'm amazing sense, but in the worship me sense. Augustus started the trend, making sure everyone knew he was more than just the guy in charge. He was the guy in charge who could smite you with divine wrath. Emperors like Caligula took it a step further by declaring themselves living gods, complete with temples and priests. Modesty wasn't exactly their strong suit. Statues of the emperor were everywhere, and you had to bow to them. Imagine having to bow every time you see a selfie of your boss. Awkward. Public worship of the emperor included sacrifices. If you didn't participate, you were considered a traitor. Nothing like forced devotion to make a guy feel loved. Some emperors were so obsessed with their divinity that they started wars just to prove they were favored by the gods. The gods probably weren't that impressed. If the emperor felt like you weren't worshiping hard enough, he might have you executed. Because nothing says godlike compassion like a good old-fashioned execution. When an emperor died, they were often declared a god officially, even if their rule was a disaster. Talk about a posthumous promotion. The Senate usually went along with it, because who wants to argue with a guy who can have you thrown to the lions? Not a debate worth having. The divine status thing was so intense that people actually prayed to the emperor for help. Imagine praying to your boss for a raise, but like, for your soul. Taboo tradition number 6. Vestal virgins, guardians of Rome's eternal flame, and their own sanity. The Vestal virgins were the keepers of Rome's sacred flame, sworn to 30 years of chastity. Because nothing says fun like eternal virginity and constant fire safety. If the flame went out, it was considered a bad omen for Rome. So, no pressure, ladies. Just the fate of an entire civilization resting on your ability to keep the fire going. These women were recruited as children and lived in a special house. They were basically the original convent, but with more fire hazards. They had some perks, like front row seats at public games and the power to pardon criminals. But one slip up, and it was game over, literally. Buried alive, to be exact. If you were caught sneaking out with a boyfriend, the punishment was severe. And by severe, I mean they buried you alive. Talk about a harsh breakup. The Vestal virgins were treated with respect, and they even had their own chariot during public events. Because nothing says VIP like your own fireproof ride. Despite the strict rules, being a Vestal virgin was one of the few ways women could gain power and influence in Rome. But that whole buried alive thing was a bit of a deal breaker. The job came with a 30-year contract. After that, you could retire and marry, though I'm guessing most were too traumatized to consider dating. Vestal virgins were said to have magical powers, like being able to stop runaway slaves or curse people who offended them. It was basically ancient Rome's version of girl power. The flame they guarded was more than just a fire. It symbolized the eternal life of Rome. So, when you're feeling stressed at work, just remember, at least you're not responsible for keeping a city alive with a candle. Taboo tradition number 7. The Roman toilet, a communal experience best avoided. Roman toilets were public and communal. No stalls, no privacy, just you and a row of strangers doing your business together. Awkward doesn't even begin to cover it. Forget toilet paper. They used a sponge on a stick, shared by everyone. Let that sink in before you ever complain about one ply again. These toilets had no flush system, so waste just sat there. The smell must have been inspirational. No wonder everyone wore strong perfumes. Sometimes, rats and snakes would pop up out of the toilets. Imagine getting an unpleasant surprise during your morning routine. Talk about a rude awakening. The toilets were often located near busy markets. So, while you shopped for fresh produce, you could also enjoy the aroma of fresh, something else. People would actually sit and chat while using the toilet. Imagine holding a full-on conversation while doing your business. Romans were nothing if not social. Roman toilets were gender neutral, so men and women used the same facilities. They really were ahead of their time, or just didn't care about personal boundaries. Sometimes, people would bring food into the toilets to eat. I guess when you're busy, you just have to multitask. But maybe not the best idea in hindsight. The lack of hygiene meant disease spread quickly. If you thought your workplace bathroom was bad, just remember the Roman equivalent probably led to more than a bad day. And let's not forget the occasional sewer explosion during heavy rains. You didn't just have to worry about getting wet. You had to worry about getting well covered. Taboo tradition number 8. The vomitorium, it's not what you think, except when it is. Despite popular belief, the vomitorium wasn't a designated place to throw up after a feast. That was just a happy accident for some Romans who overindulged. A vomitorium was actually an entrance or exit in a stadium that allowed large crowds to vomit out quickly. But tell that to the Romans who took it literally. After a big feast, some Romans would actually induce vomiting to make room for more food. It was the ancient version of a diet plan, minus the health benefits. These feasts were all about excess. We're talking multiple courses, wine flowing like water, and a whole lot of indigestion. It was the original food coma. Some hosts would encourage their guests to vomit between courses to keep the party going. Because what's a little puke between friends? The wealthy could afford to eat until they were sick. For everyone else, it was a spectator sport. Look, honey, he's going for round 3. Vomiting during a feast wasn't frowned upon. It was almost expected. If you didn't barf, were you even trying? Guests would sometimes bring their own feather to tickle their throat and help things along. A little BYO barf tool, if you will. If you thought the party was over when someone threw up, think again. It was just the signal to bring out the next course. The whole concept of the vomitorium has been largely debunked, but it's too hilarious not to imagine Romans making room for more grapes with a quick trip to the barf room. Taboo tradition number 9. Roman curses. Because sometimes you need to vent, Romans had a special way of dealing with enemies. They cursed them, but not in the modern, shout some bad words way. More like, write it down and stick it in a tomb kind of way. These curses were written on lead tablets and often included a specific, detailed list of how they wanted the curse to ruin someone's life. A little overkill, but effective. One popular curse was to make someone lose all their money, their friends, and their dignity. Romans really knew how to hit where it hurt. The tablets were often buried in cemeteries or thrown into sacred springs. So, if you were cursed, it wasn't just bad luck. It was bad luck with a side of divine retribution. Romans were so serious about cursing that they would even hire professional curse writers. Because when you need a hex, you want it done right. Some curses were just petty. One tablet reads, "May the person who stole my cloak never have peace." Clearly, someone was having a bad toga day. The curses often called upon the gods to act as enforcers, because when you really want someone to suffer, you bring in the big guns. Love curses were also popular. If your crush wasn't into you, a little dark magic might do the trick, or just make things super awkward at the next feast. People believed that curses were so powerful that just finding one could bring you bad luck. So, handling them required some serious caution, or just a really thick pair of gloves. These curses weren't just for enemies. If you upset the wrong person, even your friends might send a curse your way. Romans didn't play around when it came to revenge. Taboo tradition number 10. Funeral games. Because mourning needs a bit of bloodshed, Roman funerals weren't just somber affairs. They often included games, and by games, I mean gladiatorial combat. Nothing says, "I miss you, Grandpa," like a good old-fashioned sword fight. The games were meant to honor the dead, but they also gave the living a reason to get together and watch someone get seriously injured. A true win-win. These fights were often sponsored by wealthy families as a way to show off. "Look how much I loved my father. I hired 50 gladiators to fight to the death." Funeral games were supposed to be solemn, but let's be real. Any event with lions, tigers, and a lot of sharp objects is going to get a little rowdy. The tradition started with the Etruscans, but the Romans took it to a whole new level, adding more blood, more guts, and way more drama. The games were also a way for the deceased spirit to see that they were still in control of the family. Because what better way to show respect than with a gladiator match? Sometimes, the dead would get in on the action too. Well, not literally, but actors would dress up as the deceased and fight in their honor. Creepy? Definitely. Funeral games were also a great networking event. Nothing like bonding over a decapitation to build lifelong friendships. If you didn't host a funeral game, people might think you didn't care about your deceased relative. So, it was basically a societal obligation to spill some blood. The whole thing was part of Rome's belief that the spirits of the dead needed to be entertained, because an eternal afterlife of boredom was the real tragedy. And that's it from this video. See you in the next one.